Greetings, dear channel viewers. As you can see, today I'm trying something new. It's a simple intro, and it's not like I have skills to make it fancy, but hopefully it makes it more enjoyable. I'm already looking forward to reshooting the old videos with the new format, but right now let's focus on important things. Today I'm going to show you how you can set up and install a Windows machine on VMware, and hopefully I can walk through all the necessary steps and different options presented to you and explain them better. So we'll start by connecting to the vSphere environment, and I'm going to create a new machine which will have a role of Windows Server 2019 on it. Later I will probably want to deploy Hyper-V to show you around different hypervisor, but right now the goal is to install, set up and configure a new virtual machine with Windows on it. You may see some differences in the UI. That's because this is the latest version of vSphere. The main commands and the main concepts will stay the same. So we'll start by making a new virtual machine. With the right-click option on your host or resource pool, there are a few extra configuration settings because right now I'm connected to vCenter, which is a cluster of hosts. But the clustering knowledge is not important right now to be able to deploy the machine. I want to teach you and to show you around the settings of machine itself. So I'm going to create a new machine, and I want to name it DCHU, which is my initials letter. Basically, this is the rule of the lab I am working in, and I'm calling it HV 2019 because it will be a Hyper-V machine. And I'll put it on my resource pool in my folder. Here we go. The next step is to allocate resource pool and select which is the store or storage it will be. For me, it's a general cluster of storage disks. You may have a local storage if it's a default setup. We will not touch compatibility options. It will be Microsoft Windows 2016 or later. That's the option we have, so we can specify 2019, and we will enable the virtualization security because that allows us to use extra features which we may need for Hyper-V setup. Later we will explore together what else is required to deploy a hypervisor inside of virtual machine. It may be not as obvious as installing it on a physical server. Alright, and now the interesting part. So I would say from my experience 40 gigabytes is enough for Windows 2019 without many programs, because the footprint itself will consume at least 25 or 30 gigabytes, so it's a pretty heavy system. You could go with the core, but I want to install the UI version to show you around, so we'll want at least 40 gigabytes of a drive space. I will connect it to my default network, which I know which is called VM network. This one I have for me. Okay, and I will keep the CD-ROM, USB controller, and video card. So when I create a disk, there are a few settings which I want to show you. One of the options is location, so you could theoretically put it in different folder or in different place. In my case, I want to keep all VM files in the same folder for simplicity and for easier observation of what's going on. A very important configuration option is disk provisioning. Why? Because this is telling us how the disk is allocated. So if it's thick provisioned, it means that the whole 40 gigabytes will be immediately taken by your file. So it will create a VMDK file which will take 40 gigabytes of your space. If you pick thin provision, it will only allocate as much space as is actually used by the guest operating system. So the more files you will install and deploy inside of machine, the bigger VMDK will become until it reaches the maximum of 40 gigabytes. So thin provisioning helps you to preserve some space if you want to balance out the storage. However, it is a bit dangerous because you may over provision. So let's say if you only have 60 gigabytes of your data store and you create two thin disks, 40 gigabytes each, at first they'll be like 20-25, but at some point both of them may want to become 40, and you do not have 40 plus 40, 80, you have only 60, which will basically crash one of the disk growing operations. So if you use thin, it makes sense, especially if you don't expect to use the whole space, or if you want to get like an extra space just in case in advance, so the disk would grow. And it's like something you can deploy to make sure your machine doesn't run out of space immediately inside of the system. But it should be carefully monitored by administrators on vSphere so that the store doesn't run out of disk space. I'll keep it thin for now. Theoretically, the disk could be shared between multiple machines. This is a setting which can be used by clusters if they need a shared disk, but then it creates a lot of limitations for the drive, including snapshotting and other operations. So we'll keep it a simple, thin disk. And there is also a setting for the cache, flash cache, which you can increase. You can look up the articles in which case it's important or not. For practice, you don't really need to play with it. You could also limit input operations and output operations per second, just in case you don't want this machine to consume your whole activity. So you could balance your less critical test servers to take less activity from your storage and leave the activity for more critical servers. And the other option you see is disk mode. So there is dependent, independent, and non-persistent. These three options play a huge role in the way you handle the disk drive of your virtual machine. So by default, it is dependent. So it's basically a VMDK disk which is connected to your machine, and the machine uses it. It's called dependent because if you decide to take a snapshot, which is a checkpoint, and then you may want to go back to previous state of the disk, like to restore the machine, all the dependent disks will work, but independent disks will not be snapshotted. So you cannot snapshot and go back in time on independent disks. When I make the video about snapshots, I will explain why, but right now just remember that if you want to snapshot a machine, use the dependent disk. If you are sure that you will never need a snapshot, you can use independent. And then independent also have two different modes, persistent and non-persistent. So independent persistent is like the basic disk which can be snapshotted, but otherwise it's normal. So you'll write data to it. But non-persistent disk will always reset to base state after reboot. So after you boot up the machine, no matter which changes you do, what you install, what you configure, as long as it's running, it's fine. But when you shut it down, all the differences, all the changes are gone, and the disk reverts back. So if it was empty right now, I would make it non-persistent, and I would boot up machine and install Windows. After reboot, it would be an empty disk again. If I used an existing disk from another machine, let's say with Windows image, I would boot it up as non-persistent, work with it, but all my changes in Windows would be reset. So typically it's used by different terminal servers, like servers which do not need to keep changes, only to provide some kind of functionality temporarily, and then you reset everything done. So these settings, I would say both of them are quite situation specific. So by default, we'll go with a dependent disk, especially because I want to show you snapshotting later. And you can also select on which controller type and which controller. If you have multiple controllers, you put the disk. So this controller emulates a real controller on the motherboard where you would plug the cable. As I said, I selected the network, which is actually a property of a network card, and I want to use adapter type VMXNet Free. So by default, you have this E1000, and then you have VMXNet Free. However, when I use VMXNet Free, even though it's supposed to be more optimized for hypervisor, I will have to install extra drivers, which come with a package called VMware Tools. We'll make this step together. So without this special package, this driver will be not properly working because standard Windows normally doesn't know what this network card is. I will also keep DVD drive because I want to use it to install the system itself. So I will connect an ISO file, image file, with Windows. Controller of USB can be removed. We don't need it right now. Video card will be standard. I think it's Intel, but in any case, we don't need this for other purposes because we do not actually plan to play with something. We get a new SATA controller, and then there are some extra options like PCI controller, ID controller, in case you want to control and connect these devices later. And of course, we have a virtual keyboard, which is theoretically connected to this machine, and a virtual mouse. So these are all the default hardware components and their configuration. So keep in mind how much of CPU you get, especially if you create reservation. Uh, Pay attention to number of gigabytes of RAM you assigned, but you can change it later. It is very important to deploy a proper size of the hard disk, because otherwise you'll have to resize it. And you will want to provision it properly, because if you over provision your storage, you can run out of space. You would want to use dependent disk, and you put it on controller. LSI logic is default controller. You could use paravirtual, which is supposedly better in some scenarios with performance, but again, this is something you would only touch if you want to optimize your environment and you know what you are doing quite well. And then you have network adapter, which I switched to VMXNet free, which will be connected to my network, which I selected. And I can create new networks if I want, but by default I will use whatever I already have for simplicity. Now let's quickly look at the CPU, just in case. In the previous video I showed you that you can create a limit and you create a reservation. And I had a question, what's the difference between limit and reservation? So reservation is how much your host will always keep unused by other machines to be able to provide for this machine. So again, it is very possible to over-provision your host if you make multiple machines with high reservation. They will just allocate this CPU amount, this frequency amount, let's say, even if they don't need it, and other machines may be unable to use it. So I wouldn't use a reservation unless it's like a very critical server. It's always running, and you know that when it runs, it will have to use that amount. Otherwise, I usually don't touch this right now, at least for training purposes. And the limit is just how much it can take in total. So let's say this is a minimum it will take, this is a maximum it will take. This is the best explanation. We'll go with 4 gigabytes of RAM for now. I may have to increase it if I want to run Hyper-V on it, but that's it. So we have set up all the settings, and we are going through the steps. On the next step, we are just finishing confirming the settings, and this is where the machine will appear in the list of my machines. It shouldn't take too long. Here it is. Now, if I just boot it up, it's not going to do much because it doesn't have a Windows image installed. So the next step is to attach a Windows image so you could boot from it and install from it. Before we start the installation, let's look at the useful information we have already present in this view. Well, we have the machine name, we have the tab of guest OS which is supposed to be running. VBS true means we have enabled extra features for virtualization. It is compatible with 6.7 and later, so it's not supposed to work with ESXi lower than 6.7. The VMware tools are not running and they are not installed, so you'll have to install VMware tools. I think it's right click, guest OS, yeah, and here you have an option install VMware tools, which is right now grayed out because the machine is not running. And it would only make sense to do it once we have operating system installed to actually support drivers and programs. And there are actually different types of VMware tools for different types of operating systems. There are OpenVM tools and other versions for Linux, and standard VMware tools for Windows operating systems. And if you would install VMware tools and run the machine, you would be able to see the DNS name and IP address of the machine from the host. So the tools provide extra drivers, and they also let machine communicate back with the host, because without the tools, the machine doesn't really know that it's a virtual machine, well, besides some obvious parameters in hardware. But VMware tools provides ability for the host to communicate with the guest. There are programs like VMrun which will let you actually upload files directly into virtual machine from the host if you have VMware tools installed. And you will also be able to see DNS name and IP address from the main view, so you could manage your machines better. It is also important for different backup applications which want to connect to the guest machine, because without VMware tools, the backup application will be unable to find out the IP address of the machine to connect to it. And it shows you which host it is on. There is also monitor settings where you can set up and trigger alarms. You can also check tasks events. Once you take snapshots, like for example in this case, we can see that there are some events already. The last of them is the machine was created. And this is how you can troubleshoot if you have any problems. You can check here and you can expand the view below uh, to see what was actually happening, like the details of each event. You can actually fix quite a few problems without looking into the logs of the host by simply looking at these events. In the configure step, you can set up extra settings. Some of them are quite advanced, like vApp, which is another type of clustering called vCloud Director. There are policies which you might want to enable and disable. Uh, for example, the policy which should move machine around between your storage system if you run out of space. You also have permissions tab, where you can select and configure users and give them different permissions on this machine only. So while you have global permissions for your host, for your storage, for your cluster, you can set up separate permissions here by clicking plus or edit. You can also see which storage data stores are used by the machine. This is a quick way to check if you by chance have a disk on some other storage or some file on the storage. Maybe it wasn't your intention, or maybe you want to migrate everything from some data store. And actually these views on different machines and on global level are interlinked. So if you click on data store, for example, it will bring you to the data store settings. So it is an easy way to manage and see what's happening. For example, on the data store I can click on VMs and get back to my machine, because this is where machine is. So you can click around and see what's happening. And you have networks tab, where you can create and you can connect networks. And it can also show you if there are some missing updates, but that's something that's again provided to you by VMware tools. So let's actually start installing Windows on it. At first we need to attach an ISO file. Supposedly you have it somewhere on your system, on the hard disk. You download it from the internet, or you bring it in through USB, you connect it to the host, and now it's available to your main host. So what you do, you go to the settings of the machine, right click, edit somewhere here, edit settings, yeah. And in my case, I want to connect the ISO file, the image file, to the CD drive. So instead of using the client device option, I'm going to switch to data store ISO file, because it is one of the files which I have in data stores. And now I can browse my data stores. I have ISO data store, which strangely enough contains various ISO files which we use. Here I'm going to Microsoft servers, and I'm interested in sorry, not servers, OS, because servers is databases. And here I'm interested in Windows Server 2019 and the latest ISO version of it. It will have to be activated by our KVM system in the lab. So if you don't have activation, you may have to provide the key by yourself if you don't have it set up in your network. So now that I have selected to use the teststore ISO file, and I selected which file, and by the way, you may see in square brackets in front of the file name which data store it is from. There is one more checkbox you want to select. It sets connected power on, because if you don't do that, the disk will be disconnected. It's like it's outside of the system. You'll have to go to the settings and connect it. Right now I want it to automatically connect as I move the machine. So now I'll have this ISO disk inserted in my virtual drive, and it will be connected as soon as I boot. That should be enough. We are pressing OK. There will be a reconfiguration task which is now completed, and now I can power on the machine. And after I start powering it on, I can click on the window and select Web Console, and now it should start booting. I may have to send Ctrl-Delete to reboot it. So yeah, and now I have to press the key to boot from the CD or DVD. By the way, you may have not noticed it, but it rebooted 3 times because I clicked Send Ctrl-Delete 3 times. Here, this is where you can basically emulate Ctrl-Delete press so it doesn't get triggered on your system. It gets sent directly on the guest. So I clicked it 3 times and it booted 3 times. Now I'm going to walk through typical setup, and that should be enough. You may notice my mouse is not visible there. That's because the drivers are missing. The drivers will appear most likely with my VMware tools, so I have to use tab and enter. Okay, we'll go with data center and desktop. I don't want you to suffer the core edition, even though it may be a good topic for another video. I need to accept list license terms with tab and space, tab to the next, press enter, and now I'm going to install Windows only. This is where I am going to create a new partition for the full size. Windows will create extra small partitions for its own use, and now I can click with the tab. I'm going to next, press and enter, and now it's going to install the Windows. Once it's done, we'll see what's going on. Alright, so the installation went through, and now we have the first start of the system. It rebooted itself in a few seconds. I had to wait for like 3 or 4 minutes, and now it's starting up. Okay, now it's a step to create the password, which we'll use for the main administrator, for the main, not domain, main. It's a inbuilt Windows administrator. And now the machine is running. So I'm going to press Ctrl-Delete to log in. Provide a password. And now everything's good, but I don't see the mouse cursor. Actually, it looks like it's clicking, but it doesn't register where I am clicking. So the next important step is to actually install VMware tools. Let's go back to the UI of the vSphere, and now on right click on guest OS, the install VMware tools option is not grayed out anymore. It will give me a chance to mount the disk, which will basically connect the disk to the CD-ROM on the machine. Let's switch back. Okay. Now you'll probably find some difficulty unless you install a special tool called VMware Remote Console, which you can do. So from the previous window in vSphere itself, there is a button called Launch Remote Console, which you can install and use on your computer. But if you use the web window, you will notice that your mouse doesn't behave as you expect, because you don't have drivers yet. So right now, since we connected VMware tools, we'll have a choice to install them and to actually use the mouse properly after. But right now the question is, how do we get to the window of installation? So you press tab a few times. Alt tab will not work. It will use your main computer alt tab. As you can see, when we press tab, you can actually use your keyboard to browse different interface options. So here you would want to go to the start button, press enter, and find File Explorer on the right, which you will have by default. By pressing enter, he'll open your File Explorer. This is where you can browse your computer, and you can actually find the CD drive. Here it is. By pressing enter, you'll start the setup. If the setup is out of focus, which will happen for me now, again you have to press tab until you get to the start button, which might be not that simple. Let me right click my mouse, go back to my desktop tab. Okay, so now by switching to Internet Explorer and pressing left, I'm switching between windows. You see, Internet Explorer, and this one of the windows is my installation. By pressing enter twice and selecting typical installation, with the enter I will press it. So you'll need to practice a few times to use the keyboard in Windows without the mouse. And again, if you want to avoid this problem, just install VMware Remote Console, which you can install from vSphere UI. It is just extra program I don't need to load right now, because I just need to click enter a few times. And now that the tools are installed, you will want to reboot, and that should allow you to use your network adapter and your mouse. Okay, after reboot I can click send Ctrl-Delete and then put my password. And now, as you can see, my mouse has appeared and I can finally use it properly. So the VMware tools with the drivers were missing. And now my adapter is present, but I will want to configure it to actually work with my network. I don't have DHCP in my network, so I want to connect IP address. I'll just do it in the properties of my main network adapter. If I go to Ethernet and properties, I can actually modify the settings of my specific adapter's IP address, like you would normally do in any Windows. But that's beyond the scope of the actual video. Now I have a fully functioning Windows server with all the features I want to have. There was a hiccup when you would want to install VMware tools. You had to press tab and left right arrow keys and enter a few times to actually finish the installation without the mouse. Alternatively, you could install this remote console. Everything else is smooth and simple. You can see machine is running. It's consuming 3 gigabytes of RAM already, so if I want to use it as Hyper-V, I'll have to give it more. It is quite heavy because it's not a core edition, and Windows 2019 is consuming some space. Now, a bit of trivia for the end of the video. It may appear that Hyper-V is a Type 2 hypervisor because you install it on top of Windows system. But what's curious about it is that it's actually Type 1 hypervisor. Why? Because after you enable Hyper-V role on the Windows machine, it installs itself as hypervisor and runs your host operating system as a virtual machine. So even though it will still look like you run Windows machine on your Hyper-V host, that machine is already a host virtual machine. It's a component of hypervisor which runs under it after installation. That's why it requires a reboot as well. So it's just a bit of a trivia. And thank you so much for watching. In the future videos, we will explore VMware a bit more, install Hyper-V feature, and run some Hyper-V virtual machines. At some point, we'll talk about snapshots, backups, and other interesting technologies. And I welcome any questions. Thank you so much for watching, and have a nice day.